Well, it is a privilege to be with you tonight. Uh, this is a little bit like peeling the curtain back. It's a little self-revelatory. I have a little bit of timidity here because you're going to see how I do it. And you may go, that explains a lot. And I kind of feel like one of my favorite movies of all time is Young Frankenstein. Now, I know some of you may be thinking that's not the sort of movie a pastor ought to watch, but in some ways I'm probably not a typical pastor. But there's a point in the movie where Frederick Frankenstein, the grandson of Victor Frankenstein, is lured to the castle, and he is lured to picking up his book that his grandfather has prepared on how he reanimated life. And the title of the book is How I Did It. That's kind of what I'm giving you here. How I did it, or how I do it. And so it's a little peek back through the curtain, and I'm honored to do it. But I want you to know that I am not the exegete interpreter par excellence. You're getting a working version of what I do. And sometimes I do it better than others. But I wanted you to see this because you've been talking about how do we interpret the Bible? How do we make sense of the Bible? How do we come up with an idea of what it's saying? So the handout, I think, will be revealing in a number of ways. Just to quickly look at what's in that handout, the front page is an outline of my method. Clay's method. I wouldn't call it that. It pretty much covers some of the ground that your book has covered, but put in kind of my language and the way I do it. I combine some things and move some things in other places and what have you. This is what works for me. So that's page one, and that'll be my outline for my talk here today. And I want to pause at various points along this and ask for questions and responses and what have you. But then the rest of the handout is the first 5 pages after it, a little bit of my notes from when I did the particular passage. Then after that, handwritten notes that you probably won't be able to read, but if some of you are particularly gifted in interpreting hieroglyphics, then I put that before you. And then I wanted to give you a copy of the final result. And this was a sermon preached here at MDPC on December 29th, 2019. I wanted you to have this. I wanted a sermon, not because all of you are going to leave here and do sermons. It'd be more typical, perhaps, if you led small groups or Bible studies out of this. But for me, my sermonic preparation is not a lot different from my teaching preparation. I consider myself a teaching pastor, and it just has this in more of a form where you can see, I think he got that from there. So I wanted you, and I scripted out, so I wanted you to have these pages as a way that we can see that I moved from A to B to C with something that resulted from all of this. Because I strongly believe that what we're doing in terms of reading and interpreting the Bible is not simply so that we can read and interpret the Bible and increase our knowledge base, as worthy of a goal as that is. I am much more concerned about life transformation. And so part of my method that I talk about here is a little different from your books, perhaps in emphasis more than anything else. But why I'm doing this is to hopefully my life is touched, other lives are touched through it. And I want us to work through what I usually do when I'm preparing to preach or teach. And so you note the title. And I would add that word idiosyncratic between Clay Brown's and interpretive. I just didn't have enough room to put that all on one line. Clay Brown's idiosyncratic interpretive process for lessons and sermons. Well, the text that I used was the one assigned to me by those above me on the org chart for that particular Sunday, which was a Sunday between Christmas and New Year's, and one that I have christened as International Associate Pastor Sunday. If you have your Bible, I invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 2. And it's verses 1 through 23. It's actually the entire chapter, but if you tell people that, they begin to faint. So it's just verses 1 through 23. I'm going to read it, and I ask that you follow along. The version I used to deliver the sermon was the New Revised Standard Version. That's the Pew Bible here. And so that's what if I want people to pick up the Pew Bible and use it, I have found I need to use the version that's right in front of them. So follow along as I read this aloud, and then I'll unpack this process that I have before you. Beginning with verse 1 in chapter 2 of Matthew. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people, Israel.' Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, 'Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage.' And when they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I have called my son.' When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more." When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who are seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. All right, that's our text. That's what we're looking at tonight for a process for interpreting what this is saying, what this is meaning, and how we deal with at least some of the implications of this text. And so I have before you an outline of how I did it, to quote young Frankenstein. I began with a close reading of a biblical text, and that I want to talk about that for a moment. Some initial readings of the text for certain things, then a close reading of the text for other things, and then closer readings for yet other things. A lot of reading. That's what happens when you're dealing with the text. You got to deal with the text. And then finally, at some point, you're going, when do we put this together? Well, number 5, putting it all together, what the text is saying and meaning. And then the last 2 points, I think, are important for those who are leading studies or discussions, or it's important for everyone who's reading and studying a passage, but particularly for those who are engaged in some sort of sharing of the message with others. I want to talk about how we think through some of the implications of the text and what that means, and why I say implication, not application. And then the last point, communicating in ways congruent with the text. I think that's important too. Okay, let's get started. I have a quote that kind of talks about what we're doing and why, from the book Why Johnny Can't Preach. And if you get the play on Why Johnny Can't Read, that's intentional. The media have shaped the messengers. That's our author will be claiming that today's media age has made it hard for us to do what he calls close reading of a text. It's not only short attention spans, but a whole lot of other things too. But note this quote. Excuse me. Education through the mid-20th century was largely textual. People not only read, but they read literary products wherein how something was said was as important as what was said. Underline that if you haven't already. Some call this process reading text, because other kinds of reading do not engage this faculty of appreciating how something is said. When one reads a phone book, this is dated, isn't it? Who reads a phone book? But stay with me. When one reads a phone book scanning for information, one is not doing the same thing as when one reads a Shakespearean sonnet. When one reads the Kinsey Report on human sexuality, one is not doing the same thing as when one reads Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, although human sexuality is certainly addressed in each work. And when one reads most books about history, one is not doing the same thing as when one reads John Milton's Paradise Lost. While our culture has not yet become entirely illiterate, it has become almost illiterate regarding the close reading of texts. End of quote. Let me unpack that for a bit, because I think that's so important, and it is so countercultural. It is what we are attempting to do, to read the biblical text closely, to pay attention to it, to let it speak on its terms, and for us to listen to it, to recognize perhaps some of our own biases and presuppositions. No one comes to the text without them. To recognize them, but not to be trapped by them. To realize we can indeed come to some meaning, some understanding of what is being said and how it's being said and what it means. Because I will tell you, if you want to get my goat, if you want me to just do an unpastorly chewing out of someone, then just at the very beginning of your Bible study or small group, just say, well, what this passage means to me is, because it doesn't mean anything to us until we've talked about what it means. And we can't talk about what it means until we talk about what it says. We've got some work to do before we can talk about what it means to me. And so that's what this process in part is about. We want a close reading of a text. Now, I've got 7 steps, and it's real tempting to think that, just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it's very linear. Once you're completely finished with 1, you leave it behind and go, no. It's kind of like those stages of grief you hear about, right? Kubler-Ross's famous stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. A lot of people, when those first came out especially, thought it was, okay, I go through denial and I completely leave denial behind and go to anger, and then go to bargaining, and then depression, and then acceptance. And that's just, it's very cut and dried. And people who've been through grief go, no, that's not the way it works. I may go from anger to bargaining and then back to denial. And then from denial, I'll jump over all of that and get to depression just to beat the rush. We go back and forth all over the place. We go back and forth in any worthwhile process that you use to interpret a biblical text. You just can't help it. Number one, you never think of everything the first time you're dealing with something. You go back. You read something, you think of something that triggers something else, and you go back. And you don't be afraid of that. I mean, it is, if you're stuck on point 4, closer readings of the text, and never get to putting it all together, well, then that's a different issue, and that's a problem. In the same way that if someone's stuck in anger as they're dealing with their grief and never gets out of anger, then we think, we need to provide some help, some assistance. So there is a progression. It's just not quite as linear, as straight-lined, as putting it with numbers implies. I just want you to know that, and not to feel bad about that, because none of us ever accomplish it all on the first time. In fact, none of us ever accomplish it all on the 50th time. We are people in progress, and our understandings are in progress, and so you're going to come to it as the best way you can, and be okay with that. All right. But we are going to read the text closely if we are attentive to what God is speaking through Scripture. That's if we believe Scripture is the Word of God. That's if we believe God is speaking through Scripture, that God has somehow supernaturally superintended the writing of Scripture through human beings, but in some way the Spirit inspires it and directs it. And yes, we're going to read the text closely. And so here's one way to do that. Here's a way that I've learned over the years, and I've been an ordained minister since 1988 and was in church ministry for 5 years before that. So 1983, I'm coming up close to 40 years in this. Yes, I started when I was 5. They got that on the camera, didn't they? Oh, okay. So here's what I do. I first just read the passage. What a novel thought, to read the passage. I understand that part of the work you were given in the days leading up to this was about reading an assigned passage with at least 2 translations. Am I correct? Is that right? Okay. That's wonderful. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And when you do your initial readings, I try to think of a few things, like what jumps out at you when you're just reading it, trying to read it as best you can, and it's often hard to do with ones you've heard forever or ones that you've you've either prepared studies on before or led in a small group or whatever. It's sometimes hard to come with that newness that you need. But try your best and see what jumps out at you, what grabs you, what stands out as you're reading it. And you mark that. You note that somehow. It can be something brand new. It can be something old that you go, oh, that reaffirms that. Whatever it is, what stands out to you. And I always then, after that, I go, well, what surprises me in this text? Like there are some things in our reading from Matthew 2 that surprised me, that jumped out in a way that raised questions. We'll get to those in just a bit, some of my questions. That's good. Sometimes that's the best place to start for meaning. What are the things you don't get? What are the things that go, huh? Then I also want to pay attention to what speaks loudly when I initially read it. And that's a different thing from what jumps out at me or stands out. What speaks loudly. Here's an example. Whenever you see therefore in a passage, that should lights go off. Why? As the old cliche goes, whenever you see a therefore, you have to look back in the previous passage to see what it's there for. Most of you have heard that. That didn't stop me. Get used to that. So that just screams for attention. That's allowed. Another possibility here is if something gets repeated a number of times in a passage, in a text, I bet that's a wake up and pay attention to it. That's a shout. That's the megaphone shouting to you. So, now, I want to admit something that ministers are not supposed to admit. No, not that. I know what you're thinking. It's not that. I didn't do very well in the languages in seminary. I didn't. Now, Lorian, that's in part, yes. Not the only reason. They said that's why we have Lorian. Oh, she is a guru, my guru. I turn to her. I don't get what's this verb there. I'm not a language specialist. I made it through seminary on those. That I shined in some other areas, just not in those areas. I think there are a handful of people in this room who are conversant with New Testament Greek, but I bet most of us are not all that conversant. I mean, I know enough to use the critical apparatus and to do all that kind of stuff, to ask questions, and I don't know all that much to answer questions myself. So what do I do if I don't have this great working knowledge of Greek? Well, this is what I do. Look at the next 5 pages. Now, on this packet, you've got front and back, so it may be 3 actual pieces of paper. There. I take 4 translations of Scripture. And Bible Gateway is really helpful in this, in that you can set it up. We'll print them in columns where you can see them roughly beside one another. I print that out. And this is a sample of what you have here. I print it out and I start reading and making notes on it. And what do I note on it? Well, look at page 1 of the Bible Gateway thing. You noticed I've got Herod's name circled. All right, I figured, okay, I'm going to have to probably do a little research into who Herod was and how he did, what his reputation was. I think I know some about him, but I'm going to have to dive a little deeper into him, I bet. And then the wise men, and I notice in my translations, and note from left to right, New Revised Standard, which is more of a they might hesitate to describe it in this way, the translators, but an essentially literal translation where they do their best to be as word for word as they can be while still making sense in English. No translation makes sense going word from word from one language to the other. I have an interlinear, which has English, Greek, and fortunately what it does with the English is tell me the order that it was in the Greek so that I look back, because word order makes a difference sometimes. I know enough to read that, and you don't have to be a Greek reader to be able to read that. You can look at that yourself. But I notice that New Revised Standard says wise men. New Living says wise men. The Message, Eugene Peterson, a band of scholars. This kind of sounds like a college band playing fraternities. But the New International, which is sort of going, again, from left to right, something that's a little, the most literal translation I have, New Revised Standard, one that's more in the middle, the NIV, and then I get to the New Living, which is more thought for thought. Dynamic equivalence is the term used by the translators. They're trying to match thoughts of the text with thoughts in contemporary expression. That sometimes means they change up things a little. That's the negative side of that. They kind of take the ball and do some interpretive leaps that I'd rather do myself. That's okay. And then the Message, Eugene Peterson, he's quite clear about saying it's closer to a paraphrase than it is an actual translation. So I would never make that your primary Bible for any kind of study. But it's a good resource for trying to get another point of view. So I've got those four all together. And so I note I'm going to have to figure out about wise men and why the NIV says magi. I'm going to have to do a little digging. And then when I go down, I'm still on this first page. You're going, you don't have a life, do you? But, all right, work with me here. I notice in the New Revised Standard it says frightened, verse 3. When King Herod heard this, he was frightened. And you see that I've scribbled there that the ESV, another more literal translation, says troubled. Because Herod, from what I know of him, doesn't strike me as the type who gets frightened. What else? What's going on here? And I see the NIV says disturbed and New Living says disturbed. I circle that because I'm going to want to pay attention to that. Why that difference? Why did the translators of one choose one word? So you research that a little bit. That's the sort of example that I'm trying to give you in this initial reading to raise up questions, to raise up points of emphasis that I want to explore further. And then as I continue to read through it, I note at the bottom of page 1, going into page 2, we've got a quoting of a prophet. And this is a famous one. The footnotes in most Bibles tell you where it's from. It's from Micah chapter 5, but we're going. So is prophecy going to be important? We're bringing from another part of the Bible and quoting it here? I'm going to have to look at that. And you keep looking there, kind of the middle of that second page. I note that pay him homage, right in verse 8, the end of verse 8, goes that NIV says worship him. And so does the New Living. So what's the distinction? Why? How does that matter? I need to explore that. I also note that the New Revised Standard has the star stopped, which strikes me as a little phenomenological language, because last time I checked, while the stars were moving, we can't see them move. And so what's being expressed here that isn't expressed in the NIV and in the New Living and in the Message? So I need to find out what's going on there. Another place to dig. And then I note, after we get to the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and go, well, what is that I've heard growing up? that those were symbolic gifts representing things. Is that true? Do I need to explore what that is? Probably. I'll need to dig into that. And then a dream. All right, I just kind of note that, underline that. I haven't put a number by it yet until I notice that there's another dream right below it. Go, dreams are going to be important here. Whenever something's repeated, you pay attention to it. And so I note that we've got communication by God through dreams. Third page. Make sure I'm doing okay on time here. Third page, more things circled. I note another prophecy from Hosea about Egypt. And I'm going why does he go to Egypt? Why Egypt? Is there a way to kind of figure out what's going on there? I don't know, but I've noted that so I can pay attention to it. And then what is often called the slaughter of the innocents. And we have that Herod is tricked by the wise men, that he's infuriated, that the New Revised Standard says sent and killed. What does that mean? Maybe the NIV helps me. It says he gave orders to kill the boys. In the New Living, he sent soldiers to kill the boys. So I need to kind of figure out what that's talking about. And then another prophecy comes up, a third one, in one chapter. Prophecy is going to be important here. I need to pay attention to that. And then, just when I wasn't quite expecting it, dream number 3 at the bottom of that page. Another dream. Most of my dreams, I note with a certain Western secularist mentality, most of my dreams mean that I ate too soon to going to bed. But here, dreams seem to have significant importance for what you're being led to do. And people are able to recall those dreams. Most of the dreams I have no idea what they are 5 minutes after I've awakened. These are different in some way. So I need to deal with that. And then just kind of moving on, you got the prophecy from being fulfilled from Jeremiah. And at least this time I'm told in the text it's Jeremiah. So I go, okay, that's Jeremiah, but I need to make sure. And then landing the plane, I keep going through this, and I note that there's a fourth dream. And that Archelaus has taken Herod's place. Well, because Herod died. I go back up and read. And then that dream number 4, if my count is correct, and then another prophecy, but an unlisted prophecy. One in which I need to find out where that's coming from, if I can. That will be called a Nazarene or a Nazarene. So that's just a lot of what I try to do when I initially read. I mark things, I circle things, I highlight them. I try to draw lines. In fact, this is a neater version than I usually do. You have an example of one in your book. That's just on one page with one translation. I would urge you to do it with 2 or 3 or even 4. Because it's easy to set up and easy to do. And it just gets your mind going as that initial reading in the text. Okay? All right, so that's 1 and 2. Initial, we're close reading where I'm going with this, and then the initial readings. That's my model for you, for us who are not all that habituated with the Greek. Is this a place to ask for questions? All right, and again, the instruction to...
Can you, is it on?
Yeah, it's on. You got to hold it to your mouth, though. There you go.
When you were choosing your translations, so I just grabbed one of my parents' old parallel Bibles, and I don't even know if they still sell those. This thing was old, and it had the NAS, the NIV, the NLV, and the King James Version.
What was that third one you said? The New Living?
The New Living Version and the NIV.
Yeah, that's not a bad set either. You need, a lot of people prefer English Standard Version, the ESV, over the NRSV. It's a that's a battle not to get into here. Both of them fit the same purpose for my purposes. I want something that is more essentially literal to be able to compare other translations. So that's not a bad thing to have, parallel Bible. If you have that, I would use that.
Wait, so are these? I get lost. Is the ESV and the NRSV like the NAS or the King James Version?
The New American Standard. The most New American Standard is perhaps the most literal, to the point of sounding wooden when you try to read it out loud. You go, oh, what? They could have put a little style with that. It works. It does the same purpose, and I think that's why they include it in that one. They probably were able to get the rights to that easier than they were the NRSV.
NAS, they've changed it.
Yeah,
Oh.
and that's what some people use the Holman Standard, or it's Holman Christian Standard, which is the Southern Baptist replacement of the NASB.
So are these the four you always use? These
I
four
tend
kinds?
to use these, although sometimes, like I said, I'll substitute the ESV for the New Revised Standard. But if I'm preaching a sermon that uses the Pew Bible in the church, I've got to use the actual... I need to use that, because that's the one that people can pick up in the pew and look, and when I ask them to follow along.
The New Revised?
New
Version?
Revised Standard.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions?
Hold on, you got to use the mic.
Okay, that's what.
Thank you. To go back to when you said what jumps out at you and what speaks loudly. So when you're reading through it in different translations, and I see how you selected the prophecies and the dreams because they repeated themselves.
Yeah.
So would that be what speaks loudly?
That would be what speaks loudly.
And then when you're doing like what jumps out at you, that's kind of your Lectio Divina.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's a good way to consider it.
What you want to reflect on, what's speaking to you?
Yeah, or what's speaking to you, what kind of announces itself to you as you're reading it and goes, ah, kind of almost an aha moment. As you're reading, go, oh. Either I never noticed that before, and I've read this 50 times, but gosh, that stands out to me. So, yes.
When you're looking at different translations and you see a different word, should that be a trigger? Should you think there is something there? There is some reason that is probably significant, or sometimes is it just frightened, scared? I mean, sometimes is it just there are different people who made different translations, right? Or should you have a mindset that I need to always dig into that?
I tend to do that with verbs, because I think verbs drive the engine of the text. And so, if you got if it's a minor word, the, not T-H-E-E, but T-H-E, then I wouldn't pay attention to that particularly. But, major verbs that go, yeah, I need to spend a little bit of time in trying to figure out why one translation might have chosen this version, and another couple of translations didn't. Yeah, and some of that I'm going to look up with some dictionary tools I have. What some folks who read Greek a lot better than I do are saying about that word.
I'm a little surprised you picked the Message, because it hardly seems like a study Bible at all.
It's not a study Bible. And I meant to make that clear. Don't use it as a study Bible. What it does for me is it gives me an alternate way of hearing the words shaped that occasionally opens doors for me. I go, I never thought of it that way. And if it does that, then I'm able to explore it a little bit. But I would never have that as my go-to text. But as a conversation partner, it's not a bad one to have. And again, I'm trying to go from the more literal to less literal, and that's about the least literal translation you can find.
Do you ever use commentaries, and if so, under what circumstances?
I do much later on in the process. Unless I think a commentary can help me with, there's some commentaries that spend a lot of time on Greek vocabulary. And if I know of a commentary that I think can help me understand that word, I'll go there for that at this juncture when I'm trying to understand the words. But I try not to go to the commentaries till about point 5.
Clay, in your 40 years of ministry, I imagine you've had to preach on text more than once. So when you go back and preach on it a second time, do you start from this point? And
Yeah, I do. I try to.
And do you find that you see something new, something different?
Yes. In fact, that's the only way, unless I'm intentionally just reworking the old lesson or the old sermon, which there are times when I've done that. None of you know that because you didn't hear it the first time. But there are times when that's done, and the press of time is such that I need to do that. But if I'm wanting a fresh look at it, I start from square one. Okay. Yeah, we'll take one more, and then I need to get going.
Clay, one quick question is going to be, is the Old Testament subject to the variety of same kind of very literal all the way over? The
Talking about the translations?
Yes,
Yes.
translations compared to the New Testament?
Yes. Yeah. And I would use, regardless of whether Old Testament or New Testament text, I'd use something approximating these 4. I would try to have 4 options that I can consider. Okay. All right. What do I do after I've circled and noted and all that? Well, I start paying attention to things that will help me understand what I've circled and noted and scribbled. And those things include discussions of genre, type of literature. You know, there's some basic types of literature that you need to know about. Anyone does reading the Bible. And I have an idea you've talked about in some fashion all of these. Narrative. This is a narrative that has some aspects of other kinds of text in it, poetry in here, but it's largely narrative. But then there's also poetry in the Bible. There's a didactic prose. Think Paul's epistles, most of them. And there's also apocalyptic, which is its own different genre. So some of it, these days, doing it for close to 40 years, I tend to know what genre it is pretty quickly. So I don't spend a lot of time on the genre question, unless there's kind of a weirdness to it, like what's this song doing here in all historical narrative? Well, I've got prophecy here that sounds more like poetry in a lot of ways, and so I've got to pay attention to that. But so I don't spend a lot of time on genre, and I note that there are combination times where you've got some of at least 2 different kinds of literature jammed together, and this is evidently one of those times. And then I start thinking about context, and by context, a text without a context is a pretext, as I believe the quote at the beginning of one of your chapters in your text book. By context, I mean not just what comes immediately before and immediately after. How does it fit in, how does this fit in the Gospel of Matthew? That's important to know, what comes before it and after it. But I'm also thinking bigger picture. How does this fit in the Bible as a whole? What is its place? It's part of a gospel. How is that different? How does that help me understand? If I were reading this in one of Paul's letters, I might interpret it a little differently. Now, I might read it a little differently if it were in Acts, for example. So I've got to wrestle with that. And so the biblical context and the historical context. And you got a lot of history here. I'm going to have to read about Herod, find out what's going on there, what was going on in the time. I got to figure out something about Egypt. Why would they go to Egypt? Got to try and unpack that some. And who are the wise men? A lot of mythology about the wise men, and most of it atextual, ahistorical. There's just our nativity scenes are not always our friends as we're attempting to interpret a text like this. So I have made people angry when I've said, I think Jesus was probably born in a house. I've had people just vent their spleen, to quote Shakespeare. And I want to talk about, then I think about form and structure. How's this put together? Because there are some structures. Is there a lot of parallelism, for example? And it's more true with Hebrew writings than with Greek writings. But the Hebrews were fanatic about saying one thing in one line and then in some way repeating it in the next line. And so there are structural things like that they got to pay attention to. That's where the therefore that I mentioned earlier comes in. If there's a therefore, what's it there for? A lot of structural things. And then thinking again, moving sort of out, a little bit bigger picture, plot and flow. And plot is not just for a narrative. Every passage has a plot to it, a movement to it. And so what's the movement of this passage? How does it flow? How does it get from A to B to C to D? Narratives, and the book talked a lot about how narratives do that. It had up the point of crisis and down. Is this one of those? Could be. There's a lot to be said for that. But every passage has that kind of movement. It's 7:20. I realize that perhaps there is a need for a 3-minute break. Let's take one. All right, it's been 3 minutes, and thank you for your promptness. I think it's appropriate to ask here, as we've talked about sort of a close reading. Let me get through number 4, closer reading, and then see if there are any questions based on those two types of readings. But I want to move, and I may not spend an awful lot of time in the history of it. For example, I'm not going to write a paper on King Herod, but I do want to know which Herod I'm talking about. That's important, and kind of a little bit about him. So a commentary is nice. Sometimes notes from a study Bible are sufficient for what we're trying to do when we're teaching a class or leading a group discussion. So I'm not, please don't hear this as, well, I'm trying to write seminary papers. No. I did okay in seminary papers, but I haven't written one since I graduated in 1988. I don't expect you to write seminary papers for what I'm talking about. But after I do look at the text closely for the kinds of things I mentioned, then I want to start digging into it even more, reading it even closer, and you see what I have listed here. Words, sentences, thoughts, and then all the kinds of connections that happen when you start trying to put that together. And a lot of that we do intuitively as people who just make sense of anything communicated to us. If there are words we need to look up, we look up those words, what they mean. And if there are sentences we need to explore that we think are important, okay, we'll figure out which sentences, last time I checked, are made up of words. And therefore, if I'm dealing with words, I'm trying to see how do they fit in a sentence. Sometimes it's what receives the emphasis upon the syllable. I'm wanting to look at that. But more than that, I'm not just trying to diagram sentences. I'm trying to consider thoughts. How is this put together? What is it trying to say to me through the words arranged into sentences? Now, I admit I was an English major in college and have some graduate study in English. I enjoy this kind of thing. For some of you who come from other fields, you might be thinking, I would rather be boiled in oil. I get that. Because if you were to ask me to, I don't know, repair your car, paint my house, do anything like that, I would say I would rather be boiled in oil. So I get it. We're coming at a text from all kinds of different places. But at some point, you've got to consider how the words fit together into sentences and how those sentences lead us to thoughts. And you know there are no paragraphs in the Bible, really. Any paragraphs we have in our contemporary Bibles are put there later on by people who've translated. The text is just one giant slab of text because they're trying to fit everything they could on their delivery system. It's like trying to get everything you can on that flash drive. And that's what they were trying to do. So paragraphs are an English way of trying to make sense. So don't always go by the paragraph breakdowns. Like I don't in the passage that we're looking at. I decided not to break with the beginning of verse 7, and that instead I thought 7, all of that really ought to continue like in the NRSV. There needs to be a break at the beginning of verse 9 in my head for how this is put together. And there are some of the other translations that support me in that. But, that's just as I'm trying to make sense of how this fits together and tells the story of what it's trying to say. So, I'm looking at word definitions. I'm looking at grammar. But so much more than syntax. I'm trying to think about patterns, relationships, how the words are connected to one another. Those sorts of connections that in English we take for granted all the time. In fact, it's hard for us to read something without having all of that go on in our brains, and we're not even thinking about it. It's like riding a bike. I would suggest that most of us, for the Bible, need to see, I can actually read this and make some sense of it, just like I read a journalism article, and I can make sense of that. It's not exactly the same thing, but some of the same skills for reading text, like we talked about at the beginning, how it's put together is as important as anything else. So play with that. And if you're struggling with it to begin with, that's fine. We all do. Because we need to exercise some muscles that we may not have exercised for a while. So how does it work? How does it cohere? How does it fit together? Those are the kinds of questions I'm trying to answer at this stage. Okay, I've talked about a lot of readings of what's going on. Questions or comments at this point?
At what point do you answer the questions that you wrote down in step 2, and do you put that off until after you've worked on your textual close readings and closer readings?
Ideally, yes. The question was, when do I start assembling this? And I would say my number 5, the next step, putting it together, is when I best do that. But I'll be honest with you, a lot of times already when I'm doing the initial reading, sometimes I have an idea of where this is going. Now, what happens sometimes with me is it's not an idea that I should have had. And my later reading disabuses me of that idea, and I go, well, I need another idea. What is really going on here? But yes, I confess that there are times I jump ahead and start putting it together before I've put it together, before I've done all the reading. But yeah, ideally, number 5 is where I do that. And number 5 is also where I start looking at commentaries, unless I'm using them to help me understand some words. That I'll do that earlier. But the worst thing to do, I think, is to let the commentary tell me what to do. It's a conversation partner. Think of it as you're in a group study, only the group is a book, or a couple of 3, 4 books that are going, oh, that's interesting. No, I don't buy that. You can do that. Just because it's in a commentary doesn't mean it makes sense. My shelves are filled with commentaries that don't make sense on certain places, such as the human experience. Okay. So I move from doing the 2, 3, and 4, the initial close and closer readings, and begin assembling it. I'm wanting to say, well, it's saying. What is it saying? And then what does it mean before I can get to what it means to me? Are there other questions before I get to really unpacking number 5?
Do you find that a little bit of gap in time between these close readings is helpful, or is it boom, boom, boom?
Well, it kind of depends on my schedule for the week, but ideally I would do the close readings if this is for a sermon that I'm going to deliver on a Sunday, and so I'm backing up days before that. I would do that at the first of the week, let it gel a little bit. In the same way that if you're writing an essay, sometimes the day to look at it and make corrections is not right after you write it, but you let it sit for 24 hours. Same kind of thing for me, but that's just my personal method. Now, I will tell you, in terms of writing like the outline you've got for the sermon, I do that either Friday and Saturday before delivering it on Sunday. I'm stupid, I know. But that's because it takes a while for it to gel in my head. But that's me. I know of people who they've got it written for a Sunday sermon. It's written by Wednesday. I am not one of those people. Other questions? Okay, so you've seen this initial reading, closer reading, assembling it together. And your book had a lot to say about that, and so I want to say a few things related to it. I think it's less about finding the one lead pipe cinch meaning for that text than it is what the late Grant Osborne, a seminary professor, not of me, but just I have his book called The Hermeneutical Spiral. And he describes it as you're circling in on a meaning for the text. And you may not completely hit it in the center, but you're closer than when you were when you started. And you're spiraling in on it. That image speaks to me because I want to maintain enough humility to realize I haven't given the end-all and be-all interpretation of the passage I'm trying to deal with. I'm part of a grand conversation happening, and maybe that's where a commentary comes up and says, "Oh, I didn't think of it that way," and that corrects a little of what I was doing. But then there are a few times where I've gone, commentary got it wrong, because I think the way I'm headed here is more true to the text. You always come back on the text. So I think this notion of spiraling in on the meaning. Another way to look at this that's helpful to me, because your book talked about polyvalence, the multiple interpretations. And some of that comes from postmodernism and deconstructionism and things like that, reader response theory. Aren't you glad I went to seminary and school? That where you ultimately ends up that whatever it means to you is fine. I don't want to go there because I think texts have determinative meanings. I don't think you can take the parable of the prodigal son, for example, and say that it's about something completely alien to what the text in that parable is saying. So I think we have to hone in on that. What helps me, though, with humility, my humility of knowledge, it's this. The writer E.D. Hirsch, 40 years ago, came up with the distinction between meaning and significance. That a text will have meaning, and that meaning we ought to be able to, if Kelly's looking at a text, and whether we ought to be able to look at that and say, oh, yeah, I can see that meaning coming from it, but the significance in her life is going to be different because of where she is at the moment, is going to be different from its significance in my life. Just as the significance of Matthew 2, verses 1 through 23 will be different in an affluent suburban congregation like ours than in a house church in Iran. It's just a different setting. The meaning will hopefully be at least in the spiral, in the circle of possible meanings that make sense based on the text, but the significance of it will differ as we approach it with differing perspectives and experiences. So that's how I deal with the whole polyvalence issue. I don't want to say my interpretation is the interpretation. I think it's a pretty good one, and I'm happy with it. Now, let's take some questions. Any questions about that?
I have to see what I wrote. Oh, okay. My question is, you went to seminary, so you wait to number 5 to use the commentaries. Would you recommend that for someone with limited Bible knowledge, or do you
Yes.
see us falling off the cliff? And
No,
then just
I would suggest, that's why I put it here. I would suggest it for you, not to go to the commentaries too soon, because the commentaries are written by people, and people who went to seminary and have degrees are just as flawed as people who didn't go to seminary and don't have degrees in this stuff. And so I don't want you to jump to them too quickly. Part of it is I don't want you to miss the joy of wrestling with the text and dealing with its questions. If you go to the commentary too soon, and we all have, especially in a bind. If you go to it too soon, you lose that. You lose that discovery. And I think that's not what we want to do long term. Other comments or questions?
There is a difference, and you can probably speak to this, between commentaries and a dictionary.
Yeah.
So that if there's a word you don't know, there's
that
a difference between commentaries and dictionaries and encyclopedias and concordances and
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are books that talk about the historical setting.
yes.
I would look at that much earlier than I would point 5. I'd probably do that at 3, where I'm trying to figure out things like genre and history and historical setting and those kinds of things. Like I want to know about Herod way before I get to number 5 here.
Along those lines, so doing this study, I mean, literally every chapter, I feel like I'm looking up word after word that and I feel like I have a pretty good vocabulary.
That's the way the guild works.
So, but here's the thing. Where do because I am just literally on my phone, just typing in definition of exegesis or, and a lot of these things, when you get deeper into it, I'm not sure what source I'm even using to get the definition. So is that something that we're going to...
Were you here that week? Maybe that was the week you missed.
I've been here every week.
No.
No. If
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead. Talk about resources.
Sure. So if you want, I think the second or third week, I brought a bunch of books and I said, there's like a Baker compact Bible dictionary. Now there are volume sets of Bible dictionaries, but you can get one from Baker, which is a reputable biblical studies publishing house, like the Baker Compact Bible Dictionary for like $12 on Amazon, right? And then there's another one on on history, stuff like that. Even your study Bible notes. So a good, even compact Bible dictionary is, I'm sure you have other sources too, but that's a great place to start. That's a place where you could go look up Herod, or that's a place where you could go look up Pharisee or something like that.
I have even looked up things on Wikipedia. I know, shame on me. But we're not talking about the kind of research that you write papers from. So there are resources that are easily obtained.
So are you finding that commentaries are more of a crutch towards the meaning or the significance, or both?
I don't think the commentaries can be a crutch for the meaning, especially. It can be for the significance in my mind, but the significance is more personal to me. That a commentary can hardly ever tell me the significance. It can tell me the significance it's had for other people. Sometimes it can tell me the significance it has for the writer of the commentary. But I am more concerned about the commentary becoming a crutch for meaning, and for us missing the opportunity to work through some of this on our own before going to the commentary. It's like you're taking a test in class, and you go to the desk and ask the teacher about what's the answer to number 3. And sometimes the teacher will give it to you, but to do that long term is probably not helpful. So I'd rather we not use the commentaries as a crutch, but more, I've done this, now let me kind of check my work. Let me compare it to what some other people have said. It'd be, another way to do that is to have a group of people. Hey, I was reading this, and and this is kind of what I discovered about it, found out about it. And you have a friend who's been reading it too and goes, no, where'd you get that? Or you have the same friend goes, that's amazing. That's kind of where I was going with it too. You have that kind of dialogue going on, that conversation.
Generally, would you say that every text in the Bible lends itself to this kind of analysis and sermon?
Yes. Again, once you make allowance for differences, making sure you get the genre and get those kinds of things, this is my go-to method for beginning the process. So I think it does. It's not limited to one particular type of biblical literature, in my mind. All right. We've started putting it together, and we're dealing with the kind of spiraling in on the meaning, and we're thinking about the distinctions between meaning and significance here. It's what it's saying, what it means, and now we get to what it means to me. We're able to talk about that. I think we also have to think through some of the implications of the text. And note I say implication, not application, because I think application's overused. I have a passage I'm going to read aloud. I know you can read, but I want to read it aloud and point out some things that I think describes that distinction. It's from the book, it's a preaching book. You go, yeah, I know, work with me. Darrell Johnson, The Glory of Preaching. This opened up windows to me when I first read it years ago. Think with me about the word application or apply, and then about the word implication or imply. The two words reflect two different approaches to life. The difference is not simply a matter of semantics. Dictionary definitions begin to highlight the distinctions. Application, the act of applying. Apply, to put to use for some practical purpose. Implication, a logical relationship between two propositions. Imply, involve or indicate by inference, association, or necessary consequence. Apply conveys the idea of making something happen. The preacher says, in effect, you have heard the truth, now make it happen in your lives by doing this. Imply conveys the idea of accepting the logical inherent consequences of the truth. Let the truth work its full impact in your life. Application, to my mind, is too mechanistic, too modernistic, too humanistic in the sense of humanity as the measure of all things. Implication is more dynamic, more relational, more empowering. Apply suggests you make it happen. Imply suggests this is what necessarily happens. The fact of the matter is no one can apply the text but the Lord of the text. He is the only one who can make it happen. I think we have a tendency in our day to think of application. Okay, what is this passage making me do? And I would love to hear what you think the passage we just read is making us do with a practical import. I think you can skew passages in directions they're not intended to go. But if you start thinking about, well, what's the implications? If this stuff is true, is real, then what does it mean? How do I deal with the truth? That changes everything. It's not just we're reading every text to find out 10 steps to take, because sometimes texts don't want us to do anything. Sometimes texts want us to stop doing stuff. Sometimes texts are simply calls to worship or prayer or something unrelated to what's the practical need I have in my life right now. Because our understanding of practical is not often what God's understanding of practical is. I just want us to be open to that. So I'm more willing to talk about implications, even though I use the word apply all the time. I mean implication. What is this passage attempting to communicate to me about God? And if that's on target, what do I do about it? How do I respond? How do I live in that new reality that's been announced to me? I think that's different from let me make this happen. All right, so I want us to begin to think about what are the logical, inherent, necessary implications of some of the text we're dealing with. And then my last point here, I want to get into my sermon, because it's the best sermon ever preached, but I want to get in, before we do that, to communicate in ways congruent with the text. And by that, I'm simply saying, if you're talking about a parable, I don't think it's helpful to do a 5-part outline of 5 things I learned for this parable about how to live for God. That kind of disrupts the whole genre of parable. Sometimes it's helpful to talk about the movement of a parable. That's a different thing. I'll use main points to talk about the flow of a text. I do that all the time. In fact, I'm noted in the Building Your Faith pastor's class for having 3 points. I have 3 points every Sunday. That's one of my failings, because sometimes the text only flows 2 ways, or 4 ways, or 1 way. And I have to be open to that. So we communicate it in ways that, I have heard sermons on the 23rd Psalm that just sucked the life right out of it. I have preached sermons on the 23rd Psalm that sucked the life right out of it, because I use this didactic outline to communicate it. And it's not what you do with a poem or a song. So we communicate it in ways that are congruent with the text itself. And for those of us who lead small group discussions or teach lessons for classes, that's important to know. Okay. take the fight and the flight. It's the last few pages. I want to show you some places where this came to play in my sermon text. Of course, none of it paid attention to the very first point. That's I have to joke at the beginning of every sermon. It's another weakness of mine. International Associate Pastor Sunday. I'll say a few things about that. But then, I get out of the jokey mood and start, this is about the wise men and Herod and the slaughter of the innocents, flight to Egypt. And I begin to unpack how this is not a light and airy text. Because we often think about the wise men, for example, as, we three kings of Orient are. We think of it like a hymn, like a Christmas carol. And we need to think of it differently. In fact, I make the comment that, reading this, you'd think it was ripped out of today's headlines. If it had Brexit or North Korea or right now Ukraine, we'd think this is happening today. Despotic leader, flight from persecution, all kinds of things like that going on. And then my review of the text leads me then in point 3 of my sermon to review the plot line of that. If you're teaching something or preaching something or communicating something from Scripture, never assume people have read it or that people get it just because you read it out loud. You rehearse it, you go over it. Thus, that's part of why I go through and mark stuff and get the flow of it. So I do that here. And then I've already burned through about 5 minutes of sermon. But beginning, I get to how, like the top of page 2 of that, 3 words, perdition, promise, and providence. And you're going, where did he get that? Well, the notes that you can barely read, handwritten notes. Page 2 of that has sort of musings on providence. What's going on here? I'm noticing God's providence in this passage a lot. And I've also noticed a lot of prophecy. And I've paid attention to the evil of Herod. And just how Herod is not the only evil person on the planet. So I wrote down 3 words at the bottom of that second page of my handwritten notes. Providence, prophecy, perdition. I don't have them in the right order. I'm just trying to think through them. And prophecy gets changed to promise, because when you say prophecy to a lot of people, where they're thinking you're, foretelling the future. And I'm not foretelling the future. I'm only talking about God's promises. I end up, and I give in to the homiletical curse of sometimes you want your points all to begin with the same letter. And if I could have thrown in a hymn and a poem in there, I probably would have done that too. But anyway, so that's where I come up. That's the hook then for this. And in perdition, that's not the usual word I use for sinfulness, but I had just seen the Tom Hanks movie like that a week before. And it was fresh on my mind. And so I talk about that. And then I get to talking about Herod. And how this Herod is Herod the Great. I had to research that. And so I spend a lot of time unpacking who this Herod is. And Caesar Augustus says this about him: better to be Herod's pig than his son. He killed his sons, but he kept kosher, so he left the pigs alone. And then the quote on the page 2 from Paul Mayer: Herod's home was a can of worms simply because he married 10 wives, and each of those produced princes for him, and each of those male princes was scheming to succeed as number one, and there can be only number one. Kind of sounds like Highlander, doesn't it? And so if there weren't 2 or 3 collateral plots taking place before they had orange juice in the morning, something was wrong. I don't think they had orange juice, but you get the comment there. A historian with a sense of humor, I had to use that. So talk about what Herod's done and the massacre of the innocents, and how some scholars say, well, no, that didn't really happen. We can't find anything about that in the literature. Well, Bethlehem was so small, he only killed 10 to 15 boys. It wouldn't have been written about. Herod had a lot bigger fish to fry in terms of people he slaughtered. So that wouldn't have even been noted, not even an asterisk. Then I moved to promise. Again, my exegesis has led me to this movement of the text, and I talk about Micah 5:2-5. And I begin to say, well, that's not the only promise that's been realized here. And I start talking about all the other biblical promises that are fulfilled in Jesus. And I give a whole list of them. And Isaiah, Isaiah is not a bad go-to when you're talking about Jesus. Just saying. And then I even bring in the prodigal son. You let Scripture help you interpret Scripture. That's a good Reformation principle. And so this helps me understand it. Then I come to Providence on page 4, and that's when I begin to see, well, it's not Rhode Island. And if perdition is lostness, promise is God's grace, providence is God working at the intersection of perdition and promise, working His will. And talk about the wise men and all the myths there, and how all we know is they're really Gentile pagans who get it. And the gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, I don't think they have any symbolic meaning. My research led me to that. I do think it's immensely practical for them to have stuff that they could sell to finance their journey. In Egypt, why do they go to Egypt? Well, I'd done a little bit of research. Alexandria, one of the great cities of the ancient world, at that time the population was possibly 1/3 Jewish. Where else would a good Jewish family go? And then all the dreams. I got to account for the dreams. God speaking to people through dreams. So I get to talk about that, and I have a wonderful story that I heard when I was in Istanbul a few years ago with the Pars Theological Center, the work that we help support, one of our outreach partners, with the Iranian underground church, and a story that one of those folks from the underground church told us about the dream that brought a family to Christ. I thought, God's still doing it, isn't He? Not all my dreams. God wants to communicate with you. He's going to find a way. And then, if I can't do C.S. Lewis, I'll throw in Tim Keller. I have a Tim Keller quote to kind of sum up where I've been going with this. And this is the humbling truth. At the heart of Christianity, we love to be our own saviors. Our hearts manufacture glory for themselves. So we find messages of self-salvation extremely attractive. Whether they are religious, keep these rules and you earn eternal blessing, or secular, grab hold of these things and you'll experience blessing now. The gospel comes and turns them all upside down. It says, you're in such a hopeless position that you need a rescue that has nothing to do with you at all. And then it says, God in Jesus provides a rescue which gives you more than any false salvation your heart may love to chase. That's a killer quote. That's a true quote about the power of God's providence in our lives. And so my searching commentaries led me to a conversation partner that said, that's a great way to think about this. So this is how that played out for that particular Sunday. And I try to do that every time I'm preaching or teaching or whatever. Sometimes I'm not as elaborate with this. I don't scribble down notes always. I've been doing it long enough. I've developed some shortcuts, but I wanted to show you what I do when I'm at my best. Okay, questions. It's 8 o'clock, and I know we're coming at the end. Are there questions or comments you want to make? Or Lauren, if you want to tell me, get the hook and pull me off the stage, that's fine too.
Never. Okay, we'll do if you need to go, please go, but if you want to linger for a few minutes and ask questions, we will do that.
Clay, do you have an ideal setting? If you have a lot of time to put this together, do you have an ideal setting that gets you started to do your close readings?
By
Does it-
setting, what do you mean?
I mean, do you have a favorite place? Do you
Oh.
begin with prayer? I mean, how do you get your mind?
Well, that's one of the things. You got to pray all the way through this. But when you could get into Starbucks pretty easy, I would go there. These days, it's not quite as easy to go into a Starbucks. So I'm at home. I usually find I do better work at home than at the church office. Don't tell anyone, but yeah, someplace where I can think and usually eat. I'm eating as I'm doing this. I'm growing in the ministry.
Sort of a practical question. So how do you gauge, do you have rules of thumb that how much time you have to actually give I quote, the product? How do you?
Well, I usually, for a sermon, I'll put in 8 to 10 hours on this. For a class, it's sometimes less. And it also makes a difference if I've done prior work in it. Like with the Acts classes that we've had, I did a lot of work front end to try and help me so I didn't have to do this every time.
Yeah. Actually, I meant that's good too, but on the end, like you got 20 minutes for a sermon. How do you, or a class, you got 40 minutes.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons why I can talk about, as you have discovered, I can talk about anything almost ad nauseum. So for sermons, I script it out more than I do for classes to keep me in the 20, 25-minute range, and I do a word count. 125 words a minute is my standard go-to. Do that times, if I'm looking at a 25-minute sermon, I just do the math and then check my word count. It's not perfect, but it at least gets me in the ballpark. But if I just have like a very, 4 or 5 sentences as an outline, we'll be there for days because I can just sort of go off on it. I need the discipline of this.
Do you have any particular commentary you would recommend? Because I know there's...
Oh, yeah, all kinds of commentaries. I try not to get the really heavy-duty exegetical, because some of them just get lost in the weeds really quickly. The Bible Speaks Today is a good series that's sort of mid-level. A lot of people don't like. I even read William Barclay, Daily Study Bible. You got to take him with a grain of salt sometimes. Like he doesn't believe in some of the miracles. I go, really? You believe in the risen Jesus, but not the feeding of the 5,000? What's up with that? And so you kind of have to, you know where to take him. But the Bible Speaks Today, the Cornerstone Biblical Commentary series is another good one that I use. The NIV Application Commentary series, which is good for teachers because you're talking about the text and then bridging and then how do you communicate it to people? That helps me because I'm about communicating. I'm not just learning for learning's sake. So those are some that I regularly go to.
As you're coming up with the meaning, do you ever have a case where the meaning you're coming to might not necessarily agree with, let's say, what the Presbyterian Church thinks?
Well, no, because the Presbyterian Church is without flaw. Did I handle that well? Okay. No, there are times when the meanings that I discover will get me in trouble with certain authorities. And sometimes I've had it where the meanings I've discovered got me into trouble with a church. Like I made the mistake of, in one of Paul's letters, he talks about things being dung, or usually in modern translations, rubbish. I count it all rubbish. That's not the word. The word is a colloquial term for excrement. I didn't use the colloquial term, but I did use the word dung, and I had elders upset about it because I disgraced the pulpit. This was a few years back. I rested sure, though, in the fact that I was faithful to the text. And that's ultimately where we have to go, to be faithful to the text. Any other questions that potentially set me up for litigation? Again, take this with a grain of salt as just one practitioner's way to do it, but there it is.